The lamp was never really about the lamp. At a yard sale in LeClaire, Iowa, sometime in the late 80s or early 2000s, Danielle Colby was already reaching for it when a stranger stepped in and bought it from right underneath her hand. What came next was not an apology. He told her the time to buy something is when you see it, and instead of walking away offended, Danielle found herself appreciating that kind of bluntness in a way she hadn't expected from a stranger at a Saturday morning sale. That single moment gave television one of its most recognizable antique collecting shows, and a trio that millions of viewers would spend over a decade watching on the History Channel. It also planted the seed for a friendship that would stretch 40 years between two men and the woman who stood somewhere between them, holding the whole arrangement together with humor and loyalty and a lot of things she was never allowed to say out loud. The man who got pushed to the margins of that story, the one still lying in a hospital bed when his phone went permanently quiet, carried that silence all the way to a hospice facility in Iowa in September of 2024. What Danielle Colby has finally confirmed about Frank Fritz tells a version of events that fans had been piecing together for years, and it cuts far deeper than a canceled friendship or a broken professional relationship ever should. Mike Wolfe launched Antique Archaeology in 2001 in LeClaire, Iowa, and spent years building a reputation as a picker, someone who drove the back roads of the Midwest in search of forgotten objects buried in barns, basements, and outbuildings that hadn't been touched in decades. The concept behind American Pickers grew directly from those journeys, from the unusual characters Mike encountered and the kind of hidden American history that surfaced every time someone swung open a door to a neglected space. When the History Channel picked up the show ahead of its January 2010 premiere, it became clear almost immediately that managing the road and managing the shop were two separate full-time jobs that no single person could handle alone. Mike turned to the person he had trusted since that Iowa yard sale and asked Danielle to come work for him. She resisted for a while, not from doubt, but because she had her own artistic projects that she wasn't ready to abandon. Eventually, she looked at the situation honestly and made the decision, and that choice transformed her from a behind-the-scenes office manager into a fan favorite on one of the longest-running reality television shows the History Channel had ever produced. Frank Fritz had come into Mike's life through Bettendorf High School in Iowa. The two shared the same deep obsession with antiques and the same instinct for what picking actually meant as a way of life. And when Mike needed a road partner for the cameras, Frank was the obvious choice. On screen, Frank played the skeptical, straight-faced counterweight to Mike's restless energy, but Danielle saw something quite different in him away from the cameras. He would soften completely whenever his mother's name entered the conversation, speaking about her with an emotional openness that genuinely caught Danielle off guard in their early years together on the show. That tenderness, so at odds with the gruff persona he brought to filming, was part of what made the three of them function as a unit across all those years on the road. Off camera, they were a family in the truest sense that word can apply to people who share no bloodline, bound by accumulated time and the kind of private shorthand that only develops after years of doing something hard together and laughing at the same things along the way. Frank's final appearance on American Pickers aired in March of 2020, and the initial explanation circulated quietly enough. Back surgery, a procedure serious enough to leave him with 185 stitches and 2 metal rods permanently implanted in his spine, all of it landing on top of the Crohn's disease that had been grinding away at his health since his 20s. The timeline seemed credible, and when production resumed after the pandemic had shut everything down, the working assumption was that Frank would return once his body allowed it. But recovery never brought him back. Mike began traveling with his brother Robbie. Danielle started filling in on some road trips, and for more than a year the show went on filming while offering no official word about what had actually happened to its co-host. The silence lasted until July of 2021, when Frank sat down for an interview and made the professional story irrelevant by turning the personal one into national news. 2 full years without a phone call from Mike Wolfe, and that was what Frank couldn't move past. Not the contract terms, not the screen time, not the professional mechanics of being replaced. The part that had been building inside him through the surgery and through the slow, painful months of recovery, where he couldn't bend far enough to tie his own shoes, was something simpler and more devastating than any of that. He said Mike knew exactly how severe the back injury was and never once reached out to ask how he was doing, and that what he felt in response wasn't the frustration of professional betrayal, but the specific loneliness of realizing someone he had considered a brother had mentally moved on while he was still in a hospital bed. He accused the show of tilting so far in Mike's direction that he said publicly he couldn't even demonstrate just how lopsided the balance had become, and for the first time he put into words what he suspected had been happening quietly behind the scenes, that Mike had been working to install Robbie as his permanent replacement all along. Mike's public response arrived polished and clearly considered, calling Frank a brother and wishing him well on the next part of his journey. Frank rejected it almost immediately, suggesting to anyone who would listen that Mike hadn't written a word of it himself, and pointing out that in a full decade of working alongside each other, he could not recall Mike saying 5 genuinely kind things to him unless someone else was already in the room. None of the bitterness came from nowhere. Opioid addiction had been reshaping Frank for years, quietly hollowing out the person that Danielle and Mike had known, and the opioid epidemic that had torn through rural communities across America had not spared him. Mike would eventually admit after Frank's death that he had pushed hard for rehabilitation, that he had tried to help, and that the network's demands for clean drug tests had backed him into decisions he hadn't wanted to make. An explanation, though, is not the same weight as an apology, and Mike has never quite crossed that line in any public forum, maybe because he believes he doesn't owe one, or maybe because he understands that delivering an apology after someone is gone says more about the person speaking than the person it was meant for. Danielle held her silence for several weeks after Frank's interview landed, watching the friendship she had spent years living inside collapse in full view of an audience of millions. When she finally posted on Instagram in early August of 2021, she wrote that she was genuinely saddened by his absence and deeply troubled by the personal struggles she had watched him carry for over a decade. She acknowledged plainly that the Frank she had known had been replaced by someone consumed by difficulties she could no longer pretend she hadn't witnessed, and she said directly that he had caused himself so much pain that it had become hard to watch. She said she hoped he would get the help he needed to become well after years of being unwell. That same week, she also posted a photograph of herself with her arm around Mike on the road, captioning it with words about being proud of how he had handled the past 12 years and looking forward to many more years of rolling around this big blue marble together. Posted right at the height of the public fallout, with Frank's accusations still fresh across every entertainment headline, that photograph was not casual or accidental. It was a declaration made visible without requiring a single accusatory sentence. 2 months later, appearing on the Sailor Jerry podcast in October of 2021, Danielle spoke about how fast ego takes over in the entertainment industry, about the times she had needed help reading her own messages, without her personal feelings distorting every word. Frank's name never appeared in that conversation, but the timing placed those comments directly against the backdrop of his departure and his public accusations against Mike, and nobody listening needed a direct reference to understand what she was describing. The stroke arrived in July of 2022 like a final verdict on everything that had come before it. Frank was found unresponsive on the floor of his home in Davenport, Iowa, and what followed left him partially paralyzed, unable to move the right side of his body, his speech reduced to something that no longer answered to what he wanted to say. The stroke bore into his existing Crohn's disease, and the two conditions together generated a cascade of health complications that would define whatever time he had remaining. An Iowa court eventually appointed his friend Chris Davis as guardian, responsible for where Frank lived and which doctors he saw, while a local bank was named conservator of his finances, with authority over every dollar flowing in or out of his accounts. Property records in Scott County had already revealed him behind on taxes at his farmhouse, a modest gap that turned out to be the first crack visible above ground in a foundation breaking apart in multiple places at once. The court documents reduced everything else to numbers. Monthly expenses had climbed to nearly $28,000, with more than $22,000 of that going to the round-the-clock in-home care his condition demanded. His annual income had contracted to $60,000, a fraction of what he had earned during his American Pickers years, and the net worth once estimated at roughly $6 million on paper had become mostly theoretical, eroded by medical debt and the relentless cost of a life that required constant professional attention to maintain. The guardianship itself turned into a secondary disaster when the judge overseeing the case grew furious with both the appointed guardian and the bank for repeatedly failing to submit required paperwork on time, threatening to remove them for incompetence in a situation already defined by compounding loss. Danielle has spoken carefully about the legal arrangements in the way someone still bound by contract must speak, hinting at agreements signed and lines drawn that carry consequences, but she has never spelled out what was traded away or what was surrendered in exchange for whatever came next. Frank died on a Tuesday in September of 2024 at a hospice care facility somewhere in Iowa, with a small number of people beside him who had refused to leave, regardless of what the courts and the tabloids had done with his final years. He was 60 years old, and the life he'd built over 2 decades of antique collecting and television had come down to a quiet room and the people stubborn enough to stay in it. In the narrow window between his 2021 interview and the stroke that arrived a year later, something softer had occasionally surfaced in him. He admitted in that same conversation where he aimed his sharpest accusations that he missed the show and missed the people in it, before quickly burying the admission under more grievances and contract talk. He said he would go back if the money worked out, but the sadness underneath that condition had nothing to do with paychecks. 40 years of knowing Mike Wolfe couldn't be dissolved by a television dispute, and no amount of public bitterness could erase the fact that Frank had once considered that man a brother and had lost something that no legal settlement in any Iowa courtroom was ever going to replace. The most cutting moment of Mike's public grief came after Frank's death, in the form of a photograph shared on social media, the two of them on the road together, smiling at something just outside the frame, and a caption that ended with a single admission: he wished he had called more often. Those words, offered after the calling was permanently finished, carried more weight than anything either of them had managed to say to each other while the phone still worked in both directions. Danielle's response to the news came in the form of a photograph from the early years of American Pickers, all 3 of them together, and she wrote about missing his humor, his love of tattoo culture and antique collecting, his sharp and witty personality, and most of all those unguarded moments when he would hug her without prompting or call just to ask questions or talk something through that was sitting heavy on him. She called him a road dog and left the post at that, and the grief in those words carried none of the frustration that had marked her public statements during the years of conflict. In her Newsweek interview, near the 1-year anniversary of his passing, she said his laughter was what had held the 3 of them together through all those years of filming reality television together, and that quiet admission was as close as she has ever come to saying directly that the show lost something irreplaceable the day Frank walked out of it. The ratings have made the argument she was too loyal to make herself. American Pickers drew 3.1 million viewers at its series premiere on the History Channel, and throughout Frank's years on the show, episodes regularly pulled more than 1 million. After his departure in 2021, the audience started thinning steadily. By season 26, filmed and broadcast after his death, viewership had contracted to 442,000, the lowest figure the show had recorded since its earliest seasons, and a long way down from where it once stood. Fans have been direct on social media, calling the current version hollow and staged, describing Robbie as a replacement who generates no real connection with an audience, and saying plainly that whatever made the show worth watching left when Frank did. Television doesn't stop for grief, and the History Channel didn't pause for Frank, but the audience has been delivering its verdict with quiet consistency ever since. Some absences don't fill. Some gaps just stay open, and the people who remain keep moving forward while carrying whoever they've lost somewhere just behind them.